If you were traveling in Italy today, heading north along the ancient Via Cassia, you would be enveloped by the breathtaking beauty of the Tuscan outskirts. The sunlight here is gentle and brilliant, the rolling hills like frozen waves. Tourists come here seeking the ruins of the Roman Empire or Renaissance villas. But beneath this tranquil surface, the soil holds buried memories of another empire, a darker, more violent, and more fleeting memory. Let's turn back the clock to June 1944. That summer was unusually hot. For the German Wehrmacht, this summer was synonymous with hell. The Allies had just captured Rome, the first capital lost by the Axis powers. Hitler's southern line collapsed like paper. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers were fleeing north along the ancient Roman road, relentlessly pursued by the steel torrents of the U.S. Fifth Army and the British Eighth Army. But amidst this chaotic retreat, a highly unusual scene emerged. This is a heavy tank, number 321. Look closely at its tracks, wider than any Allied tank. Look at its armor. The frontal steel plates are an astonishing 200 centimeters thick, equivalent to 2 solid steel plates of that thickness stacked together. At the time, neither the American 75-centimeter Sherman tank nor the British 6-pounder anti-tank gun were as ineffective against it as toy guns. It is the Elefant, a problem child in the eyes of Guderian, the Inspector General of Panzer Forces of Nazi Germany, and a steel bulwark in Hitler's words. It was the most powerful ground attack weapon in the world at the time. But amidst this chaotic retreat, a highly unusual scene emerged. However, this invincible tank did not perish on the battlefield. There were no bullet holes, no scars left by armor-piercing shells. It was killed by its own crew. A thermite grenade melted the breech block, and 2 explosive charges destroyed the engine. The commander, leaving it behind, didn't even have time to take a letter from home. This was not an isolated case. In the summer of 1944 in Italy, dozens of such steel corpses lay scattered along the roadside from Anzio to Florence. Expensive and exquisitely crafted, they had become piles of worthless scrap metal before they could even see the enemy's face due to overheating, malfunctions, and lack of fuel. The seeds of tragedy were not sown in the soil of Italy, but were born on the designer's drawing board. One of the protagonists of the story is Ferdinand Porsche. Today, this name represents sports cars and speed. But in the 1940s, he was Hitler's most favored engineering genius and an extremely arrogant technocrat. In 1942, the Third Reich was searching for a heavy tank capable of crushing the Soviet T-34, the later Tiger. Dr. Porsche decided to participate in the competition. However, he disdained using traditional mechanical transmission structures. He believed that to drive a steel behemoth weighing over 50 tons, traditional gearboxes and clutches simply could not withstand the terrifying torque and would inevitably break down sooner or later. So he came up with a solution that was ahead of its time and even exceeded the limits of industrial technology at the time: a petroelectric drive system. Let's take a moment to understand this insane design, because it's key to understanding the later Italian disaster. The Porsche Tiger's interior had no gearshift lever, no drive shaft. It housed 2 Maybach HL120 TRM gasoline engines. These 2 engines didn't directly drive the tracks. Instead, they powered 2 massive Siemens-Schuckert generators. The electricity generated by the generators was transmitted through thick cables to 2 electric motors at the rear of the vehicle. Finally, these 2 electric motors drove the drive wheels, which in turn propelled the tracks. Sounds perfect, right? No shift shocks, smooth, linear power delivery. Theoretically, this is the Tesla of the 1940s. But in reality, it was a disaster. First, there was the copper. Manufacturing such a system required vast amounts of copper, a crucial strategic resource desperately needed by blockaded Germany.
Second, there was the heat dissipation problem. The electrical transmission process generated enormous amounts of heat. Inside the enclosed armored casing, the 2 generators and 2 motors were like 4 enormous furnaces. And in Porsche's design, the insulation and heat dissipation efficiency of these delicate electrical components were completely inadequate to withstand the harsh conditions of the battlefield. Despite frequent fires during testing, Porsche, through political connections, pre-produced 90 chassis. When the competition failed and Henschel's Tiger tank won, these 90 chassis became embarrassing orphans. Hitler wouldn't allow waste. He ordered these chassis to be converted into heavy tank destroyers. Engineers welded a 15-ton square fighting compartment to the rear of the chassis, cramming in an 88-centimeter 71 caliber anti-tank gun, Pak 43/2. This gun was one of the deadliest direct-fire weapons of World War II. It could penetrate the front of any Allied tank at a range of 2,500 meters. But the weight of the vehicle soared to 65 tons because of this gun. During the Battle of Kursk in the summer of 1943, these vehicles, known as Ferdinands, achieved remarkable success, but also exposed fatal survivability problems: no machine guns for infantry protection and an extremely unreliable power system. After the Battle of Kursk, the 48 surviving tanks were transported back to Austria for emergency upgrades. German engineers attempted to correct their mistakes. They added MG-34 machine guns to the front of the hull, solving the infantry defense problem. They installed commander's cupolas with periscopes, solving the visibility problem. They even strengthened the tracks and redesigned the engine grills to prevent incendiary liquid from seeping in. In February 1944, Hitler personally ordered these upgraded tanks to be renamed Elefant. It's a powerful name, implying solidity and invincibility. But some things cannot be corrected through modifications. That is its DNA. The heavy, complex, and heavily reliant on-cooling electric drive system still beat beneath the thick armor, and its next destination would be the last place it should go, the mountainous Italy. In January 1944, Allied forces landed at Anzio on the west coast of Italy, a dagger thrusting into the rear of the German lines. Field Marshal Kesselring, Commander-in-Chief of the Southern Front, desperately needed heavy firepower. He turned his attention to the newly refitted 653rd Heavy Panzer Battalion. This was the only unit in the German army equipped with Elefant tanks, and a truly elite force. The commanders, drivers, and gunners of this unit were mostly battle-hardened veterans, many having experienced the brutality of the Eastern Front. But when they received orders to go to Italy, many veterans looked at the map and fell silent. Why the silence? Because the Elefant tank was originally designed for long-range sniping on the vast flat steppes of the Eastern Front. There, visibility is excellent and the terrain is flat and hard. But what is Italy? Italy is a mountainous country. The Apennine Mountains run like a spine across the peninsula. Rivers here turn into swamps during the rainy season. Most bridges are centuries-old stone arch bridges with a load-bearing capacity of only 10 tons, while the Elefant weighs 65 tons. This means that the Elefant tank would be virtually unable to cross bridges in Italy, forced to risk wading through water or detour for tens of kilometers. Lieutenant Helmut Ullmann, commander of the 1st Company of the 653rd Battalion, described this despair in his memoirs. "We felt like we were trying to put a whale into a bathtub. It was a powerful weapon, but there was no room for it." The disaster began even before the trains were fully en route. Due to the Allied bombing of the Italian railway network, the trains carrying the Elephants were frequently forced to stop in tunnels to avoid air raids. When the trains finally arrived at the unloading point near Rome, a logistical nightmare awaited them.
We must talk about the mud. The farmland in central Italy has clay-rich soil. When dry, it's as hard as iron, but after rain, it turns into a sticky glue-like substance. Although the Elefant tank's tracks were wide, its immense weight still resulted in tremendous ground pressure. When it drove into this muddy terrain, the clay quickly filled the gaps between the tracks and road wheels. For ordinary tanks, this would simply increase fuel consumption, but for the Elefant, it was fatal. The mud would clog the cooling fan's air intake. Don't forget, this was a tank that relied on air cooling to power its generator. Once the air intake was blocked, the generator temperature would skyrocket. The insulating varnish would melt, the circuits would short-circuit, and then a fire.
On February 29, 1944, the 653rd Battalion faced its first major battle in Italy. Objective: Cisterna. This attack, originally intended to drive the Allied forces into the sea, turned into an expensive exhibition, a demonstration of how Elefant tanks self-destruct due to terrain. According to the 1st Company's combat log, shortly after the battle began, Elefant No. 131 collapsed the roadbed while turning and slid into a waterlogged shell crater. The driver attempted to use the powerful torque to reverse and escape. The engine roared and the current surged. Seconds later, the driver's cry came through the communication channel. "Smoke! The motor is smoking!" Without being hit by a single shell, the tank was rendered useless. For the soldiers of the U.S. 3rd Infantry Division on the opposite side, the scene was both terrifying and absurd. They saw these behemoths stop in the distance, yet remain silent. Initially, the Americans thought it was a German feint. Later, they realized these monsters were genuinely immobilized. So the Americans abandoned their attempts to engage in direct combat with tank guns and called in artillery. 105-centimeter and 155-centimeter shells rained down. While it was difficult to directly penetrate the Elefant's armor, the shock waves damaged external optics and severed its tracks. The Elefant became a blind behemoth trapped in a quagmire.
If the fighting on the front lines was hell, then the maintenance workshops at the rear were purgatory. We must understand the soldiers of the 653rd Battalion's maintenance company, because in some ways their fighting was even more arduous than that on the front lines. Maintaining an ELF tank was a double torment for the mechanics, both physically and mentally. There were no standardized parts for this vehicle. Many components were unique, handmade. For example, if a high-voltage relay on this tank burned out, you couldn't just use any relay from a Tiger tank. You had to wait for a special spare part to be shipped from Germany. And in 1944, Allied aircraft had cut off most of the supply lines.
Even worse was the structural design. Dr. Porsche clearly hadn't considered the ease of battlefield repair when designing the vehicle. To replace a damaged generator, the mechanic had to first remove the heavy roof armor, then use a large crane, which was often unavailable at the front lines, to lift the entire component out. This might take a few hours in the factory, but in the muddy field, under constant artillery fire, it could take days and nights. The repair company's logbook was filled with entries like missing parts, unrepairable, and recommended for scrapping.
Another problem that terrified all tank commanders was recovery. In armored warfare, tank damage is common. As long as it can be towed back and repaired, it remains a combat asset. But if your tank weighs 65 tons, it becomes an unsolvable mathematical problem. The German mainstay 18-ton half-track tractor, FAMO, simply couldn't tow an Elefant. The manual stipulated that 3 18-ton half-track tractors needed to be tandem to barely tow one Elefant. Imagine coordinating 3 tractors lined up like a train on a heavily armored front line. What a target that would be! It would be suicide. Therefore, the crew members of the 653rd Battalion knew a cruel truth. If it breaks down, it's goodbye forever. This wasn't just a mechanical problem, it was psychological warfare. Every driver pressed the accelerator with trepidation, fearing the sound of parts shattering, the sound of death.
At 11 p.m. on May 11th, 1944, the silent Italian night sky was instantly ripped apart. The Allied forces, having amassed 2,000 artillery pieces, launched a devastating attack on the German Gustav Line, codename Operation Diadem. This was not a probing attack, it was a flood. A multinational force comprised of British, American, French, and Polish troops swept through the German defenses like a tidal wave. For Field Marshal Kesselring, this meant the collapse of the line. For the 653rd Heavy Panzer Battalion, it meant their worst fears had come true: retreat.
A military adage states, "Retreat is the most difficult maneuver in war." For the elite tank, retreat was practically an impossible extreme maneuver. You need to understand the battlefield situation. It was a race. The Allies were trying to cut off the German retreat route to Rome, Route 6, and the Germans had to escape before the encirclement closed. This meant the elite tank had to undertake long, arduous, continuous marches. Continuous marches, this was precisely the Achilles heel of Porsche's hybrid system.
In May, temperatures in Italy were already soaring. Within the enclosed steel interior, temperatures easily surpassed 50 degrees Celsius. 2 Maybach gasoline engines were running at full speed, and 2 Siemens generators were emitting high-frequency electrical hums. Heat, ubiquitous heat. The cooling system was screaming. For an ordinary mechanical gearbox, overheating might only cause gear wear, but for the Geely, overheating meant the melting of the electrical insulation. A nauseating odor permeated the air, the smell of burning copper wire and insulating varnish, the smell of death approaching. Combat logs show that non-combat losses skyrocketed during the first 3 days of the retreat. Not every vehicle was completely destroyed. Sometimes it was just a stuck cooling fan bearing or a burnt-out high-voltage switch. Normally, this would have taken half a day to repair. But in the chaos of the Great Collapse, there was no time. Even stopping to cool down for an hour meant falling behind, and falling behind meant being captured by the Allied forces behind them. So the commanders were forced to make the painful decision: plant explosives in the still combatable vehicles, destroy them themselves, and then hitch a ride on a truck to continue their escape. This was a game of Russian roulette against machinery, the stake being luck, the cost being the Reich's most valuable assets.
The tragedy of the retreat reached an absurd climax in Cori. It was a crucial point on the road to Rome and a typical Italian hilltop town. The roads were narrow, built into the hillside, flanked by sturdy stone walls and houses. For mules and Fiat cars, the road was wide enough, but for the 3.4-meter-wide Elefant, it was a one-way canyon. On May 26, 1944, the remnants of the 1st Company attempted to pass through here.
The disaster began with a minor malfunction. Perhaps the lead vehicle's track broke, or perhaps it crushed the bridge while attempting to cross. In any case, it came to a stop. Like a blood clot blocking a blood vessel, the entire evacuation column was instantly paralyzed. The Elephants, half-tracks, and trucks following behind were all stuck in this narrow, deadly zone. In 1944 Italy, stopping on a highway during the day was tantamount to suicide, because the sky belonged to the Americans. P-47 Thunderbolts of the U.S. 12th Air Force spotted the feast. For the pilots, it was unbelievable. The priceless German supertanks on the ground were lined up in neat rows, unable to move. While the P-47's 50-caliber machine guns and rockets were unlikely to penetrate the Elephant's frontal armor directly, they triggered panic. Bombs exploded beside the convoy, overturning trucks and spilling burning fuel onto the road. In the chaos, one Elephant attempted to swerve to avoid the wreckage, crashing into the wall of a civilian house, burying its rear half under tons of bricks. Another Elephant tried to force its way through the debris, resulting in its electric motor overloading and burning out.
This was the darkest day in the history of the Elephant tank. Not because they were defeated, but because they were trapped. They still possessed the strongest armor and the most powerful guns, but in this cramped Italian town, they couldn't even turn their turrets. The Elephant had no turret, only the hull. They had become iron cages. The crew realized that staying any longer would only result in them being captured by Allied infantry like sardines in a can. The order was given: abandon the tanks. Abandon all tanks.
Destroying one's own vehicle is an art and also a form of torture. You can't just run away. You have to ensure the enemy can't use it. German soldiers skillfully threw thermite grenades into the precision 88-centimeter barrel. The 3,000-degree heat instantly melted the steel, welding the breech block together. Then came the explosive charges in the engine compartment. With a series of muffled explosions, 7 Elephant tanks became burning torches on the streets of Cori. During the entire evacuation from Rome, the 653rd Battalion lost more than half of its tanks. Very few died from Allied artillery fire. The vast majority perished in this humiliating act of self-destruction. With the fall of Rome, the battlefield shifted, but for the Allied technical intelligence services, the feast was just beginning. They recovered a relatively intact Elephant tank, serial number 332, from the battlefield. This vehicle had been abandoned during the retreat due to track failure, and the crew hadn't had time to completely destroy it. It was packed up and transported back to the Aberdeen Proving Grounds in Maryland, USA. American engineers couldn't wait to dissect this alien creature. When they opened the hood and saw the complex hybrid system, they were stunned.
This dissection report reveals the clash between two diametrically opposed industrial philosophies during World War II. The American engineers wrote in the report, "It is an engineering masterpiece. Every part is so finely machined, with extremely small tolerances, like an enlarged Swiss watch." But in the conclusion of the report, they added a blunt comment. As a weapon, it is a complete failure.
Why? Because the Americans subscribed to Fordism. Weapons must be simple, reliable, easy to mass produce, and easy to maintain. A Sherman tank might not be perfect, but if it broke down, any farm mechanic could fix it. The Germans, on the other hand, subscribed to an extreme form of craftsmanship, pursuing the ultimate in individual performance, sparing no expense in piling on new technologies. The Elephant tank was a distorted product of this mindset. It required engineers with doctorates to design it, and master craftsmen to build it. Yet it was entrusted to young soldiers with only a few months of training to operate it in mud and under fire. An American intelligence officer looked at this 65-ton monster and shook his head. The Germans built a mobile fortress, but forgot to give it legs to walk on.
Today, this Elephant tank, serial number 332, still stands. It is one of only 2 Elephant tanks remaining in the world. The other is in the War Trophy Museum in Kursk. It sits quietly in the museum, like a taxidermied prehistoric mammoth. Visitors marvel at its size and its incredibly large cannon. But beneath its armor, beneath its repainted surface, lies the memory of the Italian summer of 1944.
What lessons did the destruction of the Elephant tank in Italy teach us? It shattered the myth of the Wonder Waffle weapon. Nazi Germany, until the end of the war, was obsessed with finding a superweapon that could determine the outcome in one fell swoop. From jet aircraft to V-2 rockets to the Elephant tank. They believed that technological superiority could compensate for strategic folly and offset the Allies' overwhelming numerical and logistical advantages. But war is a cruel accounting. On the winding, rugged roads of Italy, victory wasn't determined by whose armor was 100 centimeters thicker, but by whose tank could cross that rickety stone bridge.
The dozens of elephant tank wrecks that once lay scattered along the streets of Rome have long since been dismantled and melted down, becoming the steel bars and rails used in Italy's post-war reconstruction. Steel has ultimately returned to the earth. And the soldiers who drove them, the young men of the 653rd Battalion, their ambitions, fears, and struggles have all cooled into the dust of history along with those cannon barrels melted by thermite. This is the story of the Elephant, a tragedy about how an engineering genius became a war monster, a steel lament played at the wrong time and in the wrong place.